Hi, my name is Jake Vossenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow. So today we're going to talk about back to the basics, so focusing on the fundamentals. So no different than being a player on a championship football team, you have to understand the fundamentals to be good at the game. That same analogy applies to farming. So you have to get the ABCs right in order to consistently raise a high-yielding, profitable crop. We can talk about all the newfangled planters, all the newfangled tractors, all the newfangled biological products, but none of that stuff matters as much as the basics, in my opinion. So we don't have time to go through all the basics. Katie only gives me a half hour for this, but I'm going to touch on some of the key basics and fundamentals and things that I think would be valuable to revisit. So starting off, we're going to talk about spreading out your maturity. It could be corn, it could be soybean, but planting a reasonably early variety so you can get started harvesting early to planting a reasonably late variety. And clearly, we all understand this, and we do it because you never know what the weather's going to do. I can't predict the weather, you can't predict the weather, but because the weather is random, using a range and maturity helps you avoid risk due to weather events, okay? So, I'll give you an example. This growing season, the second location that I planted in our research plots was at our Hampton, Iowa location. It was roughly at the end of the first week in May. Very good planting conditions, getting a little bit dry, but overall very good planting conditions. That 15-acre plot area yielded about 217 on average. Not bad yields. Our last location, which was planted in the last few days of May, actually out-yielded. It yielded about 230 bushel per acre on average. Now, typically, you would not expect that, right? We want to get the corn crop planted as early as possible, practically possible. But because of the way the rain fell this year, as you all probably know in general, we had a rainy spell toward the end of June, beginning of July, and that later planted corn caught that rain much before tasseling, where the corn up in Hampton probably caught that rain, right at or just after tasseling. So that's a great example of why spreading out maturity is a very good idea. That also happened in my soybean plots, by the way. The latest planted soybean yielded the most in 2023 only because of the way the rain fell. I think guys are doing a decent job spreading out their corn maturity. I will say, though, that in some cases I do believe we could be pushing corn maturity a little bit. We really start to see, historically speaking anyway, we really start to see yields start to plateau at that 110, 113 relative maturity. So, you definitely don't want to be planting 104s to 108s because you're probably missing out on some yield in those cases. With soybeans, that's actually my biggest concern. I see a lot of guys and gals, farmers, that are planting, a 2.8 to a 3.1. And unfortunately, a 2.8 to a 3.1 is not spreading out your risk enough because the truth is they're relative maturities. So they're relative to the other varieties that they were bred alongside, okay? And they can vary by a few days. So you really do want to try to spread your risk there in the soybean varietal maturity. And I would say that, planting soybean early is also becoming a fundamental of high-yielding soybeans. And if you're going to plant early, planting a little fuller season variety than you're used to can really help take advantage of those earlier planting dates. I actually did some of my PhD research on that, and that's a whole topic on its own. So the next fundamental we're going to focus on is soil pH. So all too often, I see a lot of soil tests, right? A lot of soil tests are shared with me by retail salespeople, by farmers, and all too often we have pHs that get too low and stay too low for too long, okay? This is something that's pretty easy to correct, right? Obviously, apply ag lime, okay? So kind of that magic number, when you get below about 5.5 for both corn and soybean pH, you're going to start to lose 2 to 3% yield in those cases. So making sure we stay on top of the lime is going to be another key fundamental. Not only will liming soils increase nutrient availability in general, but herbicides are designed to be more effective when pHs are ideal. So if you let your soil pH get too low or too high, oftentimes nothing you can do about high pH, but if your soil pH is too low or too high, your herbicides are going to generally tend to work less effectively. Another thing that sticks out in my mind is in the 2023 growing season, we saw some herbicide injury due to carryover in high pH soils. Again, nothing you can do about the high pH soils necessarily, practically speaking, but just know that when pHs get out of line, not only do corn yields and soybean yields go down, but herbicides also tend not to work as effectively. So in addition to just making sure that we stay on top of pH, the other thing that I must say is that there is no magic product. There's no calcium-based product that you're going to apply at 5 gallons or 10 gallons to the acre and fix soil pH. A lot of those products are marketed, and I get a lot of questions about those, and people might think it's a quick fix, but really the only way to correct soil pH is to use good old-fashioned ag lime in a practical, effective way. The next fundamental we're going to talk about is timely weed control. And I can't overemphasize enough how important this topic is. So let's start with corn. In corn, we've known for a long time that you don't want corn to emerge with actively growing weeds. Corn can sense on the backside of its leaves, it can sense the light reflecting off the weeds. And in response, corn will develop a more vigorously growing root system. On one hand, you might think that's a good thing, but it isn't, because what happens is then kernel number around kernel length starts being lessened because there's more energy being invested in roots than needs to, and is diverted toward the roots versus being diverted toward the developing ear. So if you have actively growing weeds in a V2, V3 corn field, which is not very big corn, there can be yield reductions as much as 5%. So it's very important to get weeds controlled timely in corn. Not quite as important in soybean, but still important. So if you have actively growing weeds in V3, V4 soybean, there's also definitely chances of yield reductions. It depends a little bit on your row spacing. But for example, there's a figure on here that'll kind of show you the yield reduction due to weeds being present at different soybean growth stages. Roughly, there's about a 5% yield loss if there's actively growing weeds in 15-inch row soybeans. I'll also say that skimping on your herbicide weed control program is asking for trouble. If you have escapes, even 2 or 3 water hemp plants per acre, we know that there could be 1 million seeds associated with those 2 or 3 water hemp plants per acre. And, you're going to have to deal with those 1 million potential plants the following growing season. So having a progressive weed control program can save you a lot of heartache, time, and money in the long run. So the next fundamental we're going to talk about is nitrogen rate in corn. So this is probably going to be a surprise to many of you, but you're going to have to trust me. For years and years and years, we applied our N rate, nitrogen rate, based on our expected yield potential. But what we've learned over the last 20 years is that there really isn't a very good relationship at all between corn yield and nitrogen rate. And I have that on a figure you're going to see on the screen here in a minute. So for example, in that figure, you will see that we were able to produce 275 bushel corn on 60 pounds of nitrogen in one case. In another case, it took almost 250 pounds of N to produce 250 bushel corn. And you can see that there's a complete scatter there. So we should no longer be basing our N rate recommendation based on expected yield potential. Instead, we should be using economics to do so. So what's the price of the corn you expect to sell, and what's the price of the nitrogen you expect to buy? You should use those two economic functions to decide how much nitrogen you're going to put on your corn. In relation to that concept, there's been a tool developed called the Maximum Return to N Calculator. That was developed by a conglomeration of Midwestern universities. You can go to that website and you can punch in the price you paid for your nitrogen and the price you expect to get for your corn, and it's going to spit out an economic optimum nitrogen rate. Now that rate, there's going to be a range associated with that rate. And the reason there's a range associated with that rate is when you get to the top of the yield response curve in corn, it takes a lot of nitrogen to increase corn yield by another bushel or two, okay? So there's a profitable rate range, and you're going to find that there's a high N rate, and you're going to find there's a low N rate. I would err on the side of the higher N rate, and that's going to help you buy some risk against weather conditions. And it's not, primarily wet weather, and it's not going to cost you a lot more money to do so. So I would really check that website out. In this specific example, I use 52 cents per pound of N, and I use 475 corn. And for corn after soybean in southeast Iowa, the rate range from 141 to 165. I would personally go with 165 pounds of N per acre. That was for the Southeast Iowa District. You can go to the website, you can punch in the northern part of Iowa, and it'll give you a rate recommendation. For continuous corn, and I want to point this out very clearly, I did the same thing, the same price of N, the same price for the corn, and that range was from 207 pounds of N to 220 pounds of N. So more than 50 more pounds of N for raising continuous corn than soybean. And that's one thing that I think sometimes we get wrong. You know, when guys, farmers, gals ask me, you know, how much more N should I be putting on my corn? You know, usually they're thinking it's 30, 40 more pounds. It's actually more than that. It's actually closer to 50 or 60 more pounds of N if you're raising continuous corn versus soybean. And talking about continuous corn, nitrogen and having enough nitrogen and having an available nitrogen is very, very important to raising good continuous corn. So don't skimp on the nitrogen when it comes to raising continuous corn. If you're interested in why there's not a good relationship between corn yield and N rate, put in the comments section you want to know why. That's a very interesting topic that I could discuss sometime, and if there's interest I can go in more detail. Unfortunately, I don't have time in this video here to do that, but that's another interesting subject on its own. So the next fundamental we're going to talk about is nitrogen timing. So this topic can get a little bit controversial at times, but we're going to talk about applying nitrogen in the fall versus in the spring. And with this topic, there can be a lot of year-to-year variability. In some places, you can get away with applying fall nitrogen and have fabulous yields. In some years or some places, you can get away with applying fall nitrogen and have fabulous yields. In other places, in other years, though, you're going to find that applying fall in leads to a lot of nitrogen loss and associated yield loss. So there is going to be some variation, but when you look at something like this literature review that was done by the Nutrient Research and Education Council for the state of Iowa, what you're going to find is that moving from fall applied nitrogen to spring applied nitrogen can increase your corn yields by about 4% on average. And at 230 bushel corn, 4% is about 10 bushels. So it can be a substantial yield increase for switching to spring applied versus fall applied nitrogen. In this same report, they suggested that applying 40% of your N as pre-plant applied nitrogen and 60% of your nitrogen as a side dress application would increase your yields by 10% relative to all fall applied N. So just know that fall applied nitrogen is risky. And in years where you have a warmer than normal winter and a wetter than normal spring, you're going to find that a proportion of that nitrogen is definitely lost. And so far in the 23-24 winter, we're setting up to be a much warmer than normal winter, which means a lot of that nitrogen has converted to nitrate, or some of that nitrogen converted to nitrate. And if we get a wet spring, a lot of that nitrate is going to be susceptible to leaching and or denitrification. So there is going to be some year-to-year variability, but if you want to guarantee you're going to have the highest yielding corn crop you can, you want to make sure you're applying spring applied nitrogen. So the next fundamental we're going to talk about is uniform fertilizer application. And this one is near and dear to my heart because, of course, we sell and promote suspension fertilizers. And with suspension fertilizers, this is pretty easy to achieve. So to back up a minute, I was recently at the ICM conferences, and Dr. Matt Darr with Iowa State, he's an ag engineer, talked about the problems and some of the solutions associated with dry fertilizer application. And the bottom line is that dry fertilizer is dry fertilizer, and it's extremely difficult to apply uniformly pretty much no matter what you do. I mean, there can be, I'm going to quote Dr. Darr. He said there's horrid dry fertilizer application and there's okay to not very good dry fertilizer application, something to that effect, okay? And so, that can be really important. And I get called on many service calls associated with sulfur streaking. I've been on many service calls associated with urea streaking, dry fertilizer application urea. One thing Dr. Darr also said is he said that he has insurance companies calling him and asking, why do we see an increase in claims associated with uneven fertilizer application? And he thought about that for a second, and it isn't that there's more uneven fertilizer application today than there was 15 years ago. The difference is now we have drones. So now we can see the patterns associated with non-uniform fertilizer application now more than ever before. So I thought that was very interesting. There's a couple figures on here showing you some of the spread patterns that, one was a study conducted by Dr. Dar and his colleagues. Another one was a study conducted at Ohio State. And they just show you that even when a dry fertilizer applicator is calibrated by ag engineers at the university, they're still not perfect. And when nutrients are limiting, that can be nitrogen, that can be sulfur, that can be phosphorus, that can be potassium. When nutrients are limiting, non-uniform application can definitely reduce yields. And with the suspension fertilizers, and I've looked at this, tested these things in the field, with suspension fertilizers, we can have very uniform application and we can reduce those yield losses. So the next fundamental we're going to talk about is banding nutrients. So I've been the research agronomist here I've been doing research here for roughly 9 years, and since day one I've been asking questions related to banding nutrients. And what I can say definitively is if you band nutrients, there is a yield increase associated with that, particularly if you band them all together. To help familiarize you with banding techniques, applying nutrients with a strip till machine is a form of banding. Using exact strip to apply nutrients is a form of banding, only we can do it much more efficiently and much faster than a traditional strip till operation. So to give you a little more idea what I'm talking about, there's going to be a figure come up here on the screen that's going to show you some data from my balanced nutrition study. So this is the average of 7 locations over 3 years. And what I found is when you apply the P, the K, the zinc, the sulfur together, there was roughly about a 14.5 bushel yield increase. When you broadcast apply those same exact nutrients, there was only roughly about a 3.5 bushel yield increase. So that's the power of applying those nutrients together. There's some things that happen with those nutrients that work together to increase yields. There's a whole 45-minute Lead Academy session on this topic, and I go into a lot of detail on why that happens. We'll put a link, and I encourage you to watch that video if you want to know the dirty details of why banding nutrients, why they work together, and why they maximize yield. So if you want to be sure that you're going to maximize your corn yields, band your nutrients. So the last fundamental we're going to talk about is achieving a nice, uniform, rapidly emerging plant stand. That is a fundamental of agronomy. So, how do you achieve that? Some things that I think about is having a well-maintained planter. That's really important. Another thing I think about is planting date. So clearly, if you're planting in cold, wet soils on April 10th, for example, the likelihood of having a non-uniformly emerging stand is much greater than if you're planting into warm, moist soils at the beginning of May. Obviously, we can't always wait for those conditions. Just know that can really dictate uniform emergence. Lastly, another thing to think about is planting into dry soils. If you're planting into dry soils, you want to chase moisture. You want to get all those seeds into moisture because that's going to lead to a uniform stand. If you have some seeds that are in dry dirt and others that are in moisture, that's going to lead to a really non-uniform stand and potential for pretty significant yield losses. So just how much does a non-uniform stand reduce yields? Well, it's debatable, but university studies show anywhere from 3 days to 8 days. That's where you start to incur yield penalties. So in other words, if you have plants that are emerging 3 days later than their neighbors, that's where yield penalties can start occurring. I would shoot for having, the crop up as even as possible, because if you do that, you're more likely to hit that 3-day or so threshold. Now, there's a lot of discussion out there about, I got to have my corn up within 12 hours of one another. That may or may not be true. If you're trying to win the National Corn Yield Contest, it could be necessary. But practically speaking, as long as all your corn's up within 3 days, you're probably in pretty good shape. The last thing I want to address is, uniformity of the stand down the row. How important is that? Yes, that's important, but it's not nearly as important as getting the crop to come up, relatively at the same time. So this is one study I have here. You can look at that. That study would suggest that you can have as much as 33% of doubles and still achieve, I think, 99% of maximum yield. I do not condone that. And I think there might be some other studies that show somewhat different results. But the bottom line is all the studies do agree that getting a uniformly emerging stand is much more critical than making sure that there's 5 inches between every plant, for example. Okay. So we covered 8 core fundamentals of agronomy today. There are many more that I couldn't get to. Katie only told me I had a half hour to do this, so I had to limit it to 8. If you have a suggestion for a fundamental of agronomy topic, please leave it in the comment section. Perhaps we'll cover it on a Liqui-Grow loop. I hope this Lead Academy session served as a reminder for things that many of you probably know, or maybe it brought it back to the surface of your mind. And I hope that you can implement, think about some of these practices, because we always want to do better. Next year's a new year, and let's focus on the fundamentals.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellence
And agronomy
development.